Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So I assume that on time I should just share my screen, right?
Yeah.
Do we need to try it, or it's just fine that I start sharing when, I mean, I have the window open.
If you want, you can just try once to see like if it is working correctly.
Yeah, I would say. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think I'd like to.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Yeah, just a second. I see I need to rearrange the, I'd like to rearrange. Oops, sorry. Just a second. I just stopped sharing for a minute because I'd like to have it in another, it opened on the other window. Just we try and share again. Let me also present and see that it's working.
Mm-hmm.
So do you see it in full screen now?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So should we just stay like this or?
Yeah, it's absolutely fine. Yeah.
By the way, so I mean, we are only hearing the Zoom while the others see it through live streaming. How does it work?
Yeah. So we will be live streaming on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I have started the live stream. Recording is paused as of now. We can start it as soon as you give us the green.
Sure. So.
Yeah, we are also live streaming on
So
Facebook.
basically, just on the same of the screen. So we are on the Zoom, right? While I'll be just being live streamed, right?
Yes.
Okay. It does. Okay. Let's see. I see that somehow here the Zoom. Okay. Yeah. On the Zoom. For some reason the Zoom panel doesn't kind of hide, but it's okay. I think we'll be fine. Okay, I think we should be fine. So is there any kind of introduction at the beginning or?
Yeah. We are just waiting for 1 minute and then we will start. I will start introducing the speakers and then one by one you can present.
Okay, and how, by the way, do you pronounce your name, just in case I want to?
Bidisha.
Can you say it again?
Bidisha.
Bidisha.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'm ready whenever you are.
Yeah. So it's 4. Should we start? Okay. Let me start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to IndoML-Session-2, and it is on machine learning in NLP. We have 3 very interesting talks from our esteemed speakers. Every talk will be 40 minutes, followed by 5 minutes question answering. The attendees are requested to post their questions in the Q&A box, and I will direct them to the speaker one by one after their talk. And with this, let me welcome and introduce our first speaker, Professor Ido Dagan. Ido Dagan is currently a professor at the Department of Computer Science at Bar Ilan University, Israel. He is also the founder of Natural Language Processing Lab at Bar Ilan and a founder and head of the nationally funded Bar-Ilan University Data Science Institute. He is a fellow of the Association of Computational Linguists. He was the president of ACL in 2010, and he led the establishment of the prestigious Tactile Journal. Today, he will be presenting his talk titled Novel Data for Modeling Textual Information, Decomposition, Multitext, and Interaction. Now over to you, Ido.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Vitisha, for the introduction. And I would like to thank the organizers of the event for inviting me to speak here. This talk would fall under the, within the theme of IndoML, the talk would fall under the data for AI theme. And as the title can suggest, I'm within the NLP community, and I would like to talk about novel types of data that we found, and at my group, we found as relevant and useful for advancing NLP research within the scope of AI. Before starting, I'd like to thank the many students, the group of students involved in the projects that I will be describing, and many collaborators from external groups. So to give some context, I'd like to refer to typical use of data in NLP, natural language processing. Generally, there are two prominent types of data that have been used in NLP. The first is representing language structure. So there's been a lot of data, many data sets created to represent language structure, mostly following some linguistic theory. And we all know that there are data sets annotated with part of speech information or syntactic trees, some semantic annotations, discourse annotations, and so on. And traditionally, these types of data sets were used to train models that can generate such language structures. So over syntactic parsing data, you would train a syntactic parser. Over semantic row labeler, you would train semantic row labeling, some semantic analysis. And the output of these models that could generate language structures or could automatically annotate text with language structures would be in turn used as intermediate representations in end-task models. That was the typical approach. On the other hand, there's another type of data sets that capture end-tasks applications in NLP, like question answering, information extraction, summarization, translation, and so on. And these data sets, like data sets of questions and their gold standard answers, were used to train task-specific models or application-specific models that would perform the end task. So used to be the state of data in NLP. Now, in this context, it's worth examining kind of the recent trends with respect to explicit versus implicit structures in NLP. So up to the burst of deep learning models, and we had kind of more feature-based models or other structured prediction models, a common practice was to first use models trained to extract particular NLP structures, language structures like parsing or semantic row labeling, name entity recognition, and so on, to extract those as features from the text, and then feed those into some kind of learning models. But more recently, when neural models evolved and became popular, we also have the end-to-end paradigm, right? Under which you just feed in raw text into your model, and this model implicitly somehow, I mean, this is just kind of figuratively, is expected to represent internally some syntactic structure or semantic structure, but this is all completely implicit, opaque, and not under our control. And then we just have the internal model that would train on the end task directly. So from that perspective, under the pure E2E paradigm, the first type of data is not needed anymore, and we are only using the second type of data. But then the question comes up whether such implicit representations are sufficient. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that at least in certain situations, it is better to still keep using intermediate structures, and many works indeed do not perform in an end-to-end manner, but others show that some intermediate language structures that we can generate explicitly can improve performance. And they also have some additional kind of benefits that they allow us for deeper understanding of the phenomena we're dealing with, better portability across domains, because end-to-end training or fine-tuning tends to be quite less transferable. They give us some interpretability and control over the end-stream task. So if we believe that some structures should be used, the questions come up, which structures we should use. And this leads me to kind of the core of my presentation, in which I'm going to talk about 3 novel data types. In fact, with respect to the introduction I just gave, the first 2 are relevant. And I'll focus mostly about the first. This suggests that we can develop some data sets and then train on them corresponding models that would capture information structure in text. And this would be both feasible and also effective for downstream use. But there's a twist here. Rather than suggesting to use some traditional semantics representations, I will be proposing to use representations that are built on natural language question-answer pairs. So it's going to be some kind of semi-structured representations. And I'll spend most of the time on this one. Then the next type of data I would like to promote is data that models or captures cross-text information relations. That would be the second part. And these 2 together kind of suggest that applications both in the single text regime or in multi-text regime could benefit for such types of representations. Then at the end, very briefly, depending on time, I would like to refer to another completely different type of data, and that's the type of data of human interaction sessions with interactive NLP applications, which is something we don't have that much, and I think we should have much more. So let me start with the first part, modeling text information structure, particularly as natural question-answer pairs. So as I just motivated, often people find that still using some explicit structures that capture language structure can be useful. This is an example for a line of works on text summarization that used AMR, abstract meaning representation, which is a formal representation, and showed benefits for summarization. More recently, if I'd like to talk about more modern approaches, just at last NACL, both these papers were presented at NACL, at recent NACL, that showed benefit of information graphs, something that looks like illustrated here, that are produced by open information extraction tuples from which you build some graphs, and they've shown that such graphs improve summarization, both to improve faithfulness as well as in multi-document summarization set. So we've seen that we've had different types of structures being used to improve in this example, summarization. Now, if you look deeper at these types of structures, particularly at structures like AMR, the first type I mentioned, which is a typical formal semantic representation, such semantic representations like AMR or others, some semantic dependencies, they rely on some pre-specified relation concepts or types, like having a lexicon of verb senses, having a repository of semantic roles, in this case, semantic roles coming from prop bank that have been used, for example, in AMR and also in other representations. Now, when we base some representation on some kind of a linguistically motivated representation that comes with a predefined schema, there are some consequences. To start with, if we have different formalisms, they would have different schemas, different inventories of roles, senses, etc. Two typical examples are FrameNet and PropBank that have different, both deal with semantic roles, but have different role inventories and formalizations. A second consequence of having such a formal schema-based approach is that it requires fairly complex expert annotation. You must really require people with understanding of linguistics or at least natural language processing and guidelines tend to be very, very heavy, very long, often dozens of pages. And thirdly, these structures are often less understood by researchers and developers that would like to leverage such structures in downstream use. And these kind of consequences, in a sense, hinder the potential of explicit representations. And I think this is one of the reasons why formal semantic representations are not that common. But there is an alternative, and people have been using an alternative. The two recent examples I've mentioned before from NACL this year, were relying on open information extraction. Open information extraction, as at least the NLP people in the audience know, take a sentence, focus on a predicate like born here, and extract a tuple where the predicate is usually the second argument, subject of the sentence is the first, and then the rest will be the other arguments will appear in the remaining tuple. And the advantage of such tuples is that they are very simple. The elements are actually natural language fragments, so it's not fully formalized. And these have been popular for their simplicity in use both in research and in industry. But still, OpenAI, traditional OpenAI has some limitations, particularly if you look at another paraphrase of the same sentence. Obama was born in 1961 in Hawaii, just changing the order of arguments, then the representation would change, which is of course undesirable. So the argument role is left undefined, and furthermore, the position becomes inconsistent. So we were looking more deeply into another proposal, which also falls under the semi-structured approaches, which is called QA-SRL, QA-driven semantic role labeling. And here, looking again at the same sentence, instead of just extracting the arguments, Obama, Hawaii, 1961, each of them will be accompanied by a suitable question. So to create such semantic role labeling representation, we will generate a question like who was born and answer it by Obama. And this would identify that Obama answers kind of the who, the semantic role. Similarly, Hawaii answers the where, and 1961 answers the when. Okay, so now we have kind of three role labels, but they are not fully formal. They are just natural language questions, but they pretty much give us a lot of information about the type of semantic relation between the predicate and the arguments. And this we found to be a very appealing approach. But then looking a bit more deeply into this representation, we figured out that, in fact, it's not just semantic role labeling. It can be perceived as a way to represent the information in this sentence, right? If you read these three question-answer pairs, who was born, Obama, where, in Hawaii, when, 1961, I gave you exactly the same information as you would get if you would read the original sentence, Obama was born in Hawaii in 1961. So in a sense, these three question answers may become a representation of the sentence, okay? But just having QSRL, just having semantic role for verbs doesn't capture all the information. That's why we extend it in something we call a QA-SEM, where our goal is to transfer the full text into a set of question answers. So just to see how rich this representation I'll show the directions in which we are expanding QSRL to become a full-fledged QA-SEM paradigm. So look at this, you can read this sentence, right? It's saying something about some trials about car batteries. And we can apply QSRL, the traditional work, I didn't mention it, but QSRL came from the UW group, Luke Zettelmeier group, started in 2015, and it did some subsequent work at 2018, and this is already work at my group that we extended further the formalism or the data annotation scheme. So if we apply this available QSRL that also has a readily available parser, we will get these two questions for the first verb, last, and these two questions for the second verb, held. And they pretty much capture basic roles that appear in this sentence and are related to the corresponding two predicates. At this point, I would just like to point out, for instance, if we look at held, we see here that published release will not be held on the planned date. These are the two arguments captured, and these are also syntactic arguments of the verb held. But in fact, when you look at semantic relations, many of them may be implicit, and it's worth spending a minute on the implicit aspect, because some semantic arguments may not be related syntactically to the predicate. Consider this sentence: I met John while he was walking in the park. Then in the park is a location syntactically connected to the walking. So we can have a question: where did someone walk? In the park. And that's an explicit argument because it's syntactically connected. But if I ask, where did someone meet someone? It's obvious that the meeting was also in the park, right? Because I met him while he was walking, so the meeting was in the park. But this becomes an implicit argument that will not be captured by syntactic analysis, yet it is captured by annotators. So the nice thing about question and answers is that it becomes very natural for annotators to capture also implicit relationships. They are not aware of the syntax, they just communicate to us or capture in their annotation what they understand from the text. And this may be confronted with another syntactically similar sentence that will not have this indirect or implicit argument. So that's about verbs. But again, if we look at the question answers about the verb, this still doesn't convey all the sentence information. We have more information, more statements, more propositions captured in this sentence. For example, some propositions or some information are captured through nominalizations, verbs used in the nominal forms. Like we have here trials, right? We had successful road trials. We may ask how was something trialed? And so would be successful. That would be the manner argument. But we can also ask what was trialed, and here we get another implicit argument that, in fact, you can understand from this sentence that the giant car battery is the answer to the question what was trial. So like the theme of the trial, and so on. Also for the argument release, the nominalization release also has its own argument. So we may also capture additional propositions. All these are statements expressed in this sentence that are captured through nominalization. Noun compounds may reflect additional statements or propositions. 300-mile mark says that this mark was of 300 miles. Adjectives may say that the release was public. And similarly for other types of noun-centered relations. And finally, it's worth also noting that statements or information statements expressed in a sentence may be expressed through discourse, not just through individual predicates. If you look at these two sentences, there's actually some assertion that's saying that these successful road trials were, despite that the road trials were successful, the battery itself didn't last beyond 300 miles. So there's some kind of despite of relation, some kind of conditional relation. And similarly, there's some discourse relation between the two sentences. So these also can be captured by question-answer pairs. So altogether, if we do annotation properly, we may be able to transform the text to a set of questions and answers, a larger set of questions and answers, which elicit or the statements or the information from different types of constructions in the sentence, and pretty much convey the entire information. So again, once again, if you read all these question-answer pairs, you would get back to the entire information captured in this sentence. And the nice thing about it is that questions, we leverage here questions that are the natural mechanism to tease information parts apart. So if we would build such data sets, we will actually be able to capture how humans, what kind of information humans capture in a text and represent that in a more explicit manner, okay? So if we compare such an approach with the question-answer pairs to a formal approach, we can see that the question-answer approach, this semi-structured approach, may have multiple benefits. On one hand, the representation is explicit. We did decompose our information, so it's explainable. I can explain on which pieces of information I relied. It's controllable. For instance, if I want to generate a summary, like in the other works I mentioned, I can choose which information pieces, which question-answer pairs to include in my summary. I may want to include the fact that the mark was of 300 miles, but maybe I will skip the fact it was successful. So these are the benefits that I get of the type of having some explicit representation. On the other hand, these are NL-based representations. They are not fully formalized. Therefore, they are first easier to annotate, as I mentioned, that I'm going to illustrate in a couple of minutes. But they are also embeddable. If 10 years ago we didn't know what to do more formal, how to operate directly over natural language structures, now we can take these question-answer pairs and use language models, pre-trained language models, embed them, and then compare language answer pairs, confront them, and make various inferences over them. So overall, this suggests that these kind of question-answer based representation can be a midway between fully structures and completely latent meaning representation that would, on one hand, would be amenable for the deep learning technologies we have nowadays, but on the other hand, would also give us some control like explicit structures. So that's what we'd like to get, but then the questions from a data perspective, data for AI, is how do we collect such data? And our current efforts are to collect such QA separately for different prominent predication types like those you see here, and these will be the slides I'll show next, a few slides I'll show next. But I would just mention that we also did some attempt back in 2018 where we just let people intuitively generate questions without much guidance, without any guidance actually. And this is in a sense even more kind of flexible. But the problem was that annotators didn't perform sufficiently well. They didn't provide sufficient coverage with respect to the questions, didn't yield sufficient consistency. So it was quite hard to get something like that of that scope just from letting people freely ask questions about the sentence. They would miss many of the relevant questions that they do perceive, but they don't notice when being asked to annotate. Therefore, we take this approach of having specific efforts which guide the annotator how to ask the question. So let me just illustrate that a little bit. So this is the annotation interface developed in this work from UW by Fitzgerald and Julian Michael. These were the lead authors, which basically is based on some grammar, some kind of finite state grammar for this possible structure of sentences to be asked about verbs. And then there is an autocomplete mechanism that guides the annotator to ask the right question. So like if here there's something that appeared and we'd like to know what appeared and get the perpetrators as the answer, the annotator would start what did, and then would have some completion. What didn't someone appear to do? What did appear, etc., and would choose the correct completion. So this would guide annotators to make more comprehensive annotation while still being very, very intuitive to use by just non-expert annotators. For the nominalization that I mentioned, we have something very similar because as we've seen, we can have a sentence like Thomas has proved something, but on the other hand, we might use a nominalization that Thomas provided proofs and we still get the same set of question and answers. There's another subtle point that comes up here is that actually some verbal nominalizations like organization are not always used in the verbal sense, and then we should avoid asking such questions. Then they don't predicate like a verb does. And accordingly, we have an annotation interface that to a large extent follows the same one with the autocomplete. Like here, some discussions with Malala, we can add who is discussing something with someone, we, because we are the discussing, and with whom, it's with Malala, and so on. And there's an additional question, whether this nominalization appears at all in a verbal kind of usage that makes sense to us with the answers. And again, this is something that non-expert annotators can do, and this is based on, here's the reference, it's a paper we had at Coding 2020. We are now, this is what I'm describing now, is what I'm saying now is ongoing work where we may have predications over nouns that are not derived from a verbal form like president. And here we have a set of templates that guide the annotator to ask relevant questions about president, like which entity organization does the president belong to? And the answer would be Ford. And what kind of president, so it's vice president, and so on. And this would allow annotators, again, very naturally to annotate noun-centered relations. And finally, also for discourse, as we've seen before, we see here another example where here we have executions were sparked by lawmakers that were requesting action to curb rising crime rates. So we see that what is the reason for requesting action? It's the curbing, and that's what the result is. And again, we have similar interfaces that showing some sentence, like here, that has two propositions, one centered around shown and the other centered around became, triggers the annotator to ask various kinds of discourse-related questions like before what, despite what, except when, what is an alternative to. These are typical informational propositions that are expressed as discourse relations, and we can solicit those as well from annotators. And here you see another example where there is no discourse marker. We just have two clauses adjacent with a comma separating them, but still the question can elicit from users the proper assertion about the relationship between these two clauses, or between these two statements. And we can see here that the annotator can ask despite what, despite he become interested in religious thought, and the answer would be despite not having shown interest in religion before. So quite intuitive interface, again, non-expert interface allows us to extract informational discourse relations that assert additional information within. And finally, for these type of questions, we would like also to extract relations across texts, across sentences. Until now, I only presented mechanisms for extracting the information from a single sentence, so getting a QA representation for a single sentence, but we would like to eventually get a representation for a full text, including cross-sentence statements or propositions. And as you see here, we have here one sentence talking about 1 million prize, and only the second sentence said that Fisher won that prize. So the argument of the agent argument of the winning is actually another sentence. And we would like to somehow guide annotators to ask questions for which the answer appears in different sentences. Now, this becomes more difficult because the search space for the annotator is much larger. And for that, we've made a first step in work that tries to generate questions regardless of the answer. So even if the model doesn't spot an answer or doesn't see an answer in the same sentence, it would generate all possible questions about the predicate one that would guide the annotator to give such questions. And this work just appeared in EMLP. It's this paper that shows how, given a predicate, we can generate questions about all possible questions for the predicate. And next step, we would like to use that for as a basis for cross-sentence annotation by guiding the annotators with which questions to ask, and then look for the answer also across sentence boundaries. So doing this kind of annotation that I've just presented is feasible, as I mentioned all along, as I claimed all along, for non-experts, and we have a lot of experience with that. But still, it's a bit more difficult than just, and more demanding than just asking people, let's say, to label documents with topics, or to even, let's say, doing probably named entity span, marking name entity span. So what we found that if you just try to do the kind of annotations using the interfaces I've shown, to do crowdsourcing in the wild, just open an Amazon Mechanical Turk or using another service, a task, and let annotators do that, you don't get sufficiently good quality. That's why we developed this methodology that we published at ACL 2020, and we call controlled crowdsourcing, where we go through several phases. Well, first, we recruit some suitable workers based on some trap tasks. We go through some training sessions in which we give them individual feedback, maybe investing half an hour to an hour in each annotator through direct kind of correspondence. And then eventually we may apply multiple annotators and perform the actual annotation. And this process we found, keeping good annotators, training them a little bit properly, yields high agreement and high agreement with expert annotation, indicating high quality annotation. These are the data collection projects that we've been going through, trying to really be able to create data sets that translate a text to a set of question answers in order to later train models that can do the same task automatically. And indeed, we have trained some models, and this is just an example for evaluation around the QA-NOM data set and also regarding QSRL, where we managed to build some parsers that generate questions and answers for verbs and for nominalizations. And what we've shown in an extrinsic evaluation, that if you further pre-train BERT on these question-answer pairs, you actually get improved performance. I won't go over the numbers here, but you can see that you get improved performance relative to just using vanilla BERT on semantic tasks that seem to require predicate argument structures. And training BERT, further pre-training BERT on this type of systematic question-answer pairs that elicit predicate argument structure perform better than if you just train it on some squad or as an example for just like an arbitrary downstream task question answer data set that doesn't cover the semantics of the data in a systematic way as the approach that I've just shown. And just to mention, we are now working on additional extrinsic evaluations where we try to use the QA representation for summarization, for checking faithfulness, for sentence fusion, and more. So this is an ongoing process, but the phase that is close to completion, still ongoing, but near completion, is the data collection. And we believe that this really provides very effective data for downstream semantic tasks that is very naturally possible to integrate within typical language model-based architectures. So to sum up on this first part, we've seen a representation that is natural language-based, easy to annotate, and help us to capture the information that humans understand in text. It's amenable for embedding because it's NL-based. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, it's controllable, it's explainable, and it can be a midway between traditional semantic representations and fully opaque representation within neural models, and can provide, but still kind of down the road, to show that it provides more broadly generic infrastructure that can benefit downstream tasks. So this wraps up the first part of my talk. The second is modeling cross-text information relations. So in the first part, I was aiming to develop a scheme that would allow us to elicit or to decompose the information in a single text. But then in many cases, we are interested in multiple texts, not in just a single one, like in multi-domain summarization, multi-op QA, knowledge-based population, and many more. In many cases, the interesting information we are up to is scattered across multiple texts, and we somehow need to model that information. And more broadly, we could think of multi-text comprehension as a fundamental challenge. Testing models for their understanding of language should require not only understanding a single text, but also being able to look at multiple texts together and somehow jointly comprehend them. So just to illustrate what's the kind of at least one main difference between having a single text and multiple text, is that when we have a single text, we can view what we are trying to do as trying to find certain relations within this text, like semantic roles or coreference resolution. And overall, we can see semantic analysis of a single text as a set of links, as well as some types within the single text. But then when we have multiple texts, we become interested actually in relations across these texts. So maybe the most basic type of relation would be matching. If we have multiple texts, I mean, if the two texts are discussed completely different topics, then there's no relationship between them, and then it's not interesting. The interesting aspects become when the two texts are related and having some related or overlapping information. So one relation we'd like to find is matching, is matching between text pieces. Another one is to find complementary information. For instance, here in the rose garden, we have multiple types of information. See, by the way, I might have kind of miscalculated my time here, but I'll rush a little bit more in this part. So we would somehow like to capture this type of relationships. And how would we do that? So to start with, if we have like 4 texts here, the classic way of modeling cross-text information is modeling cross-document coreference. These would mark or identify different mentions in different texts that all relate to the same entity or event, like President Obama, or the naming here, naming, let's say, here, and the approach here, both refer to the same naming event. And we've done some work on cross-document coreference, extended it with several data sets. You're welcome later to look at these references, but I would like to talk now briefly about extending these works to a broader level, a proposition level. And again, because I just see that I had some mismatch here with calculating the time, so I'll skip this first work. I just point at the paper, which suggests to align work not just for individual elements, but for complete propositions. Just as an illustration, identifying that this proposition about Prime Minister Hun Sen is the same as the red proposition here, and similarly doing for other proposition spans. So it's kind of decomposing the matches between different texts to a substantial level that goes into individual statements, individual propositions centered around the predicate. But I'm going to skip this one, again, for this kind of time shortage. And I'd like just to point out at another work that tries to bridge information or link information between the texts, between 2 different texts, using the same QA approach that I've shown in the first part. And the idea here is that if you have a single sentence presented with its QASR representation, look at this sentence about an earthquake rattling certain regions, we can decompose this sentence to these 3 question-answer pairs. Okay, the first one refers to the agent of the rattling, and the second to 2 arguments of the location. If we have 2 related sentences talking about the same earthquake, we can try and represent each of them with its own set of questions. This is the one for question A, and this is a set of questions for question B. Now we can again turn to annotators, because this is a very natural and intuitive representation, and ask them to align those. So it is quite feasible to get from, again, non-expert annotators an alignment that the first 2 question answers are aligned and refer to the same information, and that the second question answer pair for sentence B refers to the same second and third question answer pairs in the first sentence. So there is a coreference here because both of them refer to the location. And being able to do that, we could collect a data set with high inter-annotator agreement. And we've also seen that we can align much more information across the text than can be done if you just do element level, as in traditional cross-document coreference. And we've also seen that doing that is helpful for downstream tasks. In this case, we applied it to the sentence fusion task, where you have 2 sentences and need to generate a summary. So the typical way to approach this task nowadays is fit these 2 sentences into a seek-to-seek model, but specifically we were working with BART, and BART will generate a target sentence. What we tried as well is to inform BART with the alignments produced by our QA alignment model, the model that was trained on on the data set that we created, and that would mark for bar that this order and this ordered are aligned, or this mediation are aligned. And this yielded much better few sentences. With the baseline, BART had a strong tendency to just pick only one of the sentences as the output, while with our alignment information provided, BART, in 50% more cases, actually fused information coming from both sentences, which is our end task. So the takeout is that as we want to have explicit presentations and data sets that represent the internal semantic structure or information structure within a single text, as I've illustrated with the as I've promoted with the QA approach, we also want to bridge across texts in the way that I just mentioned. And this can also be done using question-answer representations. And we could solicit from humans not only how they understand the meaning of a single text, but also how they relate the information across text. And again, this can be useful in downstream tasks, but it's only initial steps and there's a lot to explore. Abidish, I assume we are running out of time, right?
Yeah, if you want to take, you can take a couple of more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe just a couple minutes. I mean, the last part was, originally I intended to make it short, but I'll make it even shorter. So the main part of my talk was what I described so far, trying to create explicit representations of meaning that will be useful for single and multi-text applications. I'd like just to make a teaser pointing at another line of work, which is about interactive NLP applications. And we know, just the elevator pitch here is that most NLP applications that we have nowadays are static. And when we develop such applications, they are in batch mode. You just have some data set that simulates a task like summarization. You get your input text or multiple text, and you need to generate a summary. However, in many NLP applications, it seems that interaction could help for two main reasons. For one, you might be adjusting dynamically to the user needs, create better summaries, maybe define better information extraction classes. On the other hand, it may also improve quality. We all know that even with the greatest and latest models we have, performance is not always so good, especially in challenging settings. So users may help the machine to obtain better results. And for that, we need interactive systems that are still not that popular. And I'll just illustrate, I'll just show here like a paper we published again at last NACL that shows us a scheme for interactive summarization where when you want to present, let's say, a summary of 25 articles about global warming, you would first get the standard static summaries, an initial summary, but along with it, you get suggested queries about additional information that you might explore. So suppose I'm interested in learning more about carbon dioxide in the context of global warming, I can click it and get more information. Or I might see that it also talk about greenhouse gases, and I might ask about that and get more information about greenhouse gases. So this way, I can explore much more dynamically, much more effectively the information than getting in a single text, in a single summary or in a static setting. So what and I'll skip this one. What I'm suggesting here is that we should be able to evaluate such interactive settings, and that's in this paper. You're welcome to look. But more often, more importantly for our context, is that we should start collecting data sets of interactive user sessions with NLP applications, interactive NLP applications. And again, this can be done using a controlled crowdsourcing manner similar to what we've been doing in the first part. So I would encourage you to have a look at this paper and try to get from that inspiration also for other NLP tasks. As said, this is only a teaser. So here I'd like to conclude, maybe just show quickly my acknowledgement slide and open for questions. So maybe I'll just the conclusion slide for the questions.
Thank you very much for your talk. Yeah, I think we are running out of time, but we can take a couple of questions. So yeah, so first I will ask the panelists if they have any questions. People can post it to the Q&A chat box if they have any. Yeah.
So can I ask?
Yeah, sure.
So thank you, Professor, for this nice talk. So in this interactive summarizations, from where are you getting those topics? Are those predefined, or you are discovering those topics?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a relevant question. So in this, I mean, the goal of this research step was basically to try and extend the framework of static summarization, particularly multi-document summarization, where the input is a set of 25, cluster of documents in a topic, and the output is a single static summary. This is a well-established task for, a couple of decades now. So we followed the same setting and extended it to the interactive setting. So actually we use the same data sets, DAC and text data sets, if you're familiar with them, used for static multi-document summarization, and we leverage them for the interactive setting. Of course, it will be very interesting maybe to expand the interactive setting also for dynamic data collections. You can assume that during an interactive summarization session, a system might conduct additional searches, let's say, and bring in more documents. But the first phase we presented this year follows the standard setting, but extend the summary generation to interactive setting. The data remains the same as in the static setting.
Thank you.
We have one question. Can a generative model generate these questions?
Yes. So as I mentioned, for QSRL, QA norm, the normalization, and QA discourse, there are already parsing models that generate the questions. In fact, we are now working with an architecture that uses a seek-to-seek approach in order to make a comprehensive parser for all of them. So the answer is that we have initial results showing that the seek-to-seek approach is promising. And for QSRL specifically, there is a downloadable parser. So if you would like to work firstly with a verb kind of question answer pairs, just look at the 2018 papers in my slides, and you can download an effective, high quality parser for verbs on a seek-to-seek approach.
So we have another question, but for the sake of time, probably we can answer that offline. Yeah.
So people are welcome to send me email. I'll be happy.
Sure.
Happy to answer, because I don't have QA interface here.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this talk. Let us now move to our second speaker, who is Dr. Manaji Choudhar. Dr. Choudhary is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research Lab India. His research interests include various subfields of NLP and its intersections with cognition, linguistics, and societal impact. Dr. Choudhary is an adjunct faculty in Plaksha University and IIIT Hyderabad. He is the general chair of the Panini Linguistics Olympiad and the founding co-chair of Asia Pacific Linguist Olympiad. Today, he will be presenting his talk titled Applications and Techniques for Code Mixed Text Generation. Over to you, Dr. Manaji Choudhar.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. And are these slides visible too?
Yes, yes.
Thank you, Vidisha. And thanks to the organizer for the invitation. What I'm going to talk today is very, very aligned to the theme, which is applications of data in AI and AI for data, right? Data for AI and AI for data. I think that's sort of the theme. So I thought I will talk about applications and techniques for generating code mixed data. And I'll in a moment come to why this is an important problem and what all we can achieve by doing that. Now, this all of you must be familiar with, that NLP has kind of gone through a revolution in the last 5 or so years, and especially just in the last 2-3 years, if you see, our models have grown really big, and not only big, also better. So GPT-3 is huge, and it's also an old news. Now we have bigger models than GPT-3. You would have heard about things like data is the new oil. Some people say it's the new electricity. And the side effect of all this is linguistic insights are no longer useful. It's kind of, nobody says it explicitly, but it's kind of everywhere. You talk to students during interviews, you talk to people in the industry. It's very apparent that nobody cares anymore about linguistic insights. But is it really so? Do we really don't need linguistic insights? And what I'm going to argue, and pretty much along the lines of Ido, what Ido said, that how linguistic information, structural information can really help even these giant models like BERT and all. So it will be similar kind of an argument, but applied to a very different settings. So what I'm going to argue is, when data, or let's say the oil, is scarce, at that time, linguistic insights can tell us how to generalize from little amount of data. And that's one thing. And the other thing it tells us is how to create natural like data sets. So when you don't have data, either you need to create data or learn from little data. And in both the cases, linguistic insights is really helpful. To take an example, if you think of warfare, right, all through the history of humankind, and even in our mythology, you'd see that when you are fighting an army which is much stronger than you, you need war tactics, strategies, and you can still beat that big army. But if you really are on the other side, that is, I have really a big army, I seldom think of war tactics. Then what I think about is how to organize my army better, how to mobilize my army better. So I become more inward looking. So I look inside my model, how to scale them up, and how to train them faster and all that. But when you don't have that luxury of so much data or big army, you need to rely on external sources. What kind of external sources? How the landscape looks like, how can I take the enemy by surprise, right? So similarly, what kind of insight I can have from users? Can I use interaction as an approach? Can I generate data through some tricks and tips and so on, right? So this is the central theme of this talk. And I'm going to illustrate it with a problem which I have, and our group has spent quite a lot of time working, 10 years actually, which is code mixing or code switching. Code mixing refers to mixing of 2 or more languages in a single conversation, sometimes even in a single utterance. And we in India, most people do it all the time. Between Hindi and English, we mix and all that. So it's very common. All of you would be extremely familiar with this. But it's not only in India. Code mixing happens across the globe, right? So here are examples of tweets taken from various parts of the world. And you see various different kinds of languages are mixed. This top one here is actually Turkish and German. This is French and Arabic. I think this is English and Spanish, so on and so forth. So it happens all over the world. Various kinds of languages are mixed. And let me give you a little bit of more context to tell you why this is important before we get into the problem. So think of a multilingual society, like the one in which we live in India. So there are multiple languages which are spoken, and everybody are speaking the same set of languages all the time. So when that happens, right, there is a stable multilingualism. People are talking about the same set of languages. What happens is there are various kinds of interactions that happen between the languages. Okay, so one of the interactions is code switching, but that's not the only interaction. So you might have multilingual discourse. somebody gives an entire talk in English followed by the same talk in Hindi so that it's accessible to all. So that's a multilingual discourse, but not necessarily mixing. On the other hand, you take words from the other language and use it. So there are lots of English words in Hindi, or lots of Bengali, Hindi, other Indian language words in, let's say, English, Indian English especially. So these are the two extremes. In between, there are all sorts of things, and code mixing is what we are going to look at. Why code mixing is interesting and challenging compared to these two extremes is that if it's a multilingual discourse, you separate by language and separately process, most of the time you are fine. If it's, borrowing of syntactic structures or words in a language from another, you don't even have to treat it as a different problem. It's a monolingual processing. You just have to collect data in the right way. But when you have code mixing, you cannot avoid the problem that's staring at your face, that there are multiple languages which are being mixed at syntactic level, at semantic level, at lexical level, at all levels. And somehow you have to process it. And, many of you might already know it's very intuitive, and we have showed it through a series of work that the monolingual techniques typically fail to solve the code mixing problems. So if you were to build an NLP system for a multilingual society like in India, you have to tackle code mixing, and the current technology is, I'm talking of, let's say, 10 years ago, that technology was very poor. Things have changed recently, and that's the interesting bit which I will emphasize in this talk. Now, a little more about the context. So it's very common to, by the way, if you look at Twitter, 3.5% of the tweets, actually, there's a lower limit. It's probably a little more than this, are code switched. And note that there is no incentive for code switching on Twitter because it's a broadcasting medium, but still people code switch. And it varies by geography, as I already said. So some places like, Paris, I think Istanbul, you have a heavy amount of code switching. We observe some 13%, 10% of the tweets are code switched. This is, by the way, Twitter statistics. So I'm not talking of how much code switching people do in day-to-day life. On the other hand, places like Houston, San Francisco has less, let's say 1%, 2%. Nevertheless, it's everywhere. We could not find a city where there is no code switching. So it's a pervasive problem. It's a major problem. I mean, pervasive phenomenon, major phenomenon, and it requires to be handled. So if this is the case, right, it's pervasive, it's everywhere, people do it all the time, then where the problem of data comes from? There should be a lot of data, right? But that's the paradox of code mix data that I'm going to talk about. See, code mixing is predominantly a spoken language phenomenon. So people mix language mostly when they're talking. Now, therefore, you really don't have Wikipedia, which is code mixed, books which are code mixed. You can crawl the web, but most of the data will be monolingual, right? Not code mixed. And speech corpus is harder to get. Then what do you do? Where do you look at for data? So then you could think of, Twitter, social media, or in general, other kinds of user-generated content on the web. There might be code mix because people typically tend to write as they speak in some of the social media platforms. So that's there. But the problem is, there are massive privacy concerns. You can't just go and scrape the data and start working on it. And even if somebody can, definitely you can't share it publicly for the research community. This third problem is automatic detection of code mixing is very difficult. So the data doesn't come up with a meta label, right, that I'm code mixed. So you have to first identify if the data is code mixed. And for that, monolingual language detection is reasonably easy, even though that's also not fully solved. But code mixing is much harder to detect. And of course, like any other data collection problem, labeling is expensive. If you want to get labeled data for, let's say, sentiment analysis for code switching, natural language inferencing for code switching, that's going to be expensive. One extra dimension of this expense adds with code switching. That is that now so suppose I want to get Dutch and Turkish data annotated for sentiment. Where am I going to get annotators for? In fact, we tried that, and Mechanical Turk doesn't help. It's very hard to get people who know a couple of languages and equally proficiently. So it's kind of a hard problem. So we have been, as I said, looking at this problem for last 10 years or so under these ages of Project Melange. There are a lot of my colleagues. I have put many many interns, research fellows have worked over the years. Too many of them to read out their names, but they have a lot of contribution, and all the stuff that I'm going to talk about are their work. But I specifically want to call out Kalika, Bali, and Sunena, who three of us work in this Project Melange, have been working in this Project Melange since the inception. I would also like to call out a lot of external collaborators, especially in IIT Kharagpur. Right in Loy, we have worked together on quite a bit of problems on code mixing. Right now, I'm working with some of the people from IIIT Hyderabad. So a lot of contribution from a lot of people are here. And Microsoft has a new research institute set up in Africa. It's called MARI in Kenya. And we are working with them to look at code mixing in African languages like Swahili and English. And there are lots of languages, Sheng and so on. It's also a very fascinating space. Now, I don't have time, and neither I intend to go into all the work that we have done over the years, right? But I just want to set the context of what I want to come to, right? That we need to generate data because there is not enough data. I want to say what all the different kinds of models you can think about when you are solving code switching. One is you could think of code mixed data as a monolingual corpus and treat it as you do a monolingual corpus, right? It would work. But then there is a data explosion problem. For every pair of languages that is code mixed, you have to collect separate data and large amounts of data. If you are trying to build a GPT-3 for Hindi English code mixing, imagine the data you would need, right? The other way is to split it. So split into languages and then separately treat the languages. As I said, it works well when the languages are not mixed quite often. So like multilingual discourse, but when it is all mixed, like in code mixing or code switching, this doesn't work very well. And there are some other methods where you simultaneously process this using models of both the languages and finally put a combination logic and things like that. They work to some extent. Actually, along this line, this is the best model, but can we do better is the question. If you want to find anything about all the stuff, so this is what all we did till 2018, and now the situation is going to change. So if you want to find anything about all this work, I have put all these resources. There is a tutorial that we did, pretty extensive one and all. So I'll leave the slides with the organizers so you can get access to all this. Now coming to what happened in 2018, 2019. We had MBERT. What is MBERT? So we are now talking of this massively multilingual zero-shot learning. It's also called zero-shot cross-lingual transfer. The phenomenon is sometimes referred to. I'm not getting into the details because I know all of you or a lot of you are aware of this. So what happens is you have a BERT-like model, a transformer-based language model, which instead of one language, you train with multiple languages. These are all monolingual corpora. So English monolingual corpus, Hindi, French, Swahili, and so on, maybe hundreds of them. You train and you get a massive model, let's call it MBERT. And then when you are trying to build a task on top of it, you just train a few layers for with task-specific data for just one language, let's say, or a few languages. So I want to build a sentiment analyzer. I just train it with label sentiment data for English, which is pretty commonly, usually English is the language where data is more readily available. But what's interesting is now these models start working for all the languages, albeit to various degrees. So cross-lingual zero-shot transfer is very lossy or noisy, depends on a lot of factors, but it does, transfer across languages reasonably well. So this is what is the magic of what is called the cross-lingual zero-shot transfer or zero-shot learning. So the question then we can ask is, now that we have MBERT, and by the way, MBERT was the first one, we have much better models now, like XLM Roboter was better than MBERT, and there are even like multilingual T5 and other models coming up. There is Turing, the Microsoft's multilingual model, and so on. Now, these are even more powerful. So one question is, this multilingual zero-shot transfer, what it means is your model kind of knows all the languages, right? In some sense, it's able to process data in across these languages. So then shouldn't it be automatically able to process code mixed data? So if my model like this MBERT already supports English and Hindi and Spanish, it should be able to support Hindi, let's say, by the same logic, right? So this is the thing that we wanted to test first, that is it true? So more specifically, I have this massively multilingual pre-trained model on unlabeled data from L1 to Ln, and I now fine-tune it on data from task data for only one language, L1, and I want to check if it can actually now process L1, L2 code mix data. And by the way, I mean, I might also want to check L2, L3 code mix data. It doesn't have to be like one of pivot languages. So this is the setup, experiment that I want to try. But if you want to try any such experiments, first you need, again, data. Now we need test benches, test data. And this has to be labeled, right? So as I said, it's very hard to get labeled data. Fortunately, over the last 10 years, again, people have built these data sets through part of various shared tasks. So there is a computational processing of code mixing series of workshop. As a part of that shared task, some data was created. There are similar shared tasks in India as a part of ICON, which is happening right now, another conference, then FIRE, Forum for IR Evaluation. So people have created these test benches. So what we did is we thought, okay, can we create a data set like glue-like data set? Let's call it glucose, glue for code switching. So this is a data set, by the way, built upon data sets which are already created by other people. So we just combined them and benchmarked it, plus included a few of the data sets that we ourselves built. At the same time, similarly, there is another data set which came up, which is called Lindsay from another group. And this is also a very useful data set. There's an interesting difference between the two, which one should remember, which is the glucose idea was that let's take few language pairs. So English, Hindi, and English, Spanish were the chosen languages because most of the data sets are there, and have a large number of tasks across those languages, starting from, let's say, LID, which is a very basic task, all the way to NLI, natural language inferencing, which is our question answering, which are higher level tasks. Similarly, whatever was available for Spanish, we did that. On the other hand, Lindsay actually goes language wise. So as many languages. So they have fewer tasks, but more languages. So one interesting thing to note is look at this last column. It shows how many total instances were there, right? And you see the numbers seldom goes beyond few thousand, right? There are only few tasks. One is the sentiment analysis for English, Hindi, and then this is, LID, language identification for Spanish English, and this is named entity recognition for Spanish English, which had tens of thousands, actually just like 110,000 or so on, but nothing more than that. So data is still an issue. Now, when we do the vanilla MBERT, we just run the vanilla MBERT, fine-tuning it on the task data for English. What do we observe? So this is interesting. In some cases, we also do, by the way, few short learning on this training part of the code switch data. So that also in some of the cases we do. Anyway, so what we observe is this first column that you see is the SOTA, state of the art, before 2018. So how this SOTA was obtained was, those were the era of word2vec, and we were talking of cross-lingual embeddings. So cross-lingual embeddings using word2vec, and with that kind of SOTA, and actually a lot of other things on top of it, I'm not getting into the details, which people tried. These were the numbers we got, and these are the MBERT numbers, where nothing more was done actually on top of MBERT. So it just almost came for free. We didn't do anything extra for code switching. And look at the numbers, right? I mean, everywhere it beat the SOTA, existing SOTA. Not only that, you had big jumps at places like let's say 77% to 87% for pause tagging, or let's say 89% to 93% is a pretty reasonable jump again for English, Spanish, and so on. So that's one observation, that it did very well. So our intuition is right, it works. But there is one more thing. Note the absolute accuracies, right? Are these good enough? NLI 60%, post tagging on one particular data set 60%, sentiment analysis 58%, same for Spanish 66% sentiment analysis. Nowhere close to the monolingual performance that we get for English, for Hindi, for Spanish, right? Individually. So there is a huge room for improvement, and that is required. There is a need for improvement. Not only a room for improvement, there is a need for improvement. So what do we do? What can we do? So this was the model that we tried, right? And which bit the SOTA. Now, can we improve on top of it? So one idea is, there is a lot of work which talks about this continued pre-training for domain adaptation. When you are trying to adapt these language models, let's say BERT, for a particular domain, let's say biomedical domain or something, you train it a few more epochs with a lot of biomedical domain data. So we thought maybe we should do the same. Let's say L1, L2 code mix data, and we are interested in L1, L2 code mixing. So I take a lot of this data, and this have to be unlabeled, by the way. So that's probably easier to get. We'll come to how easy it is to get. And then we train these models, do continued pre-training, and then we can, run the rest of the pipeline as is. Or we could do continued pre-training and fine-tuning with little bit of code mix data, like I already mentioned. We could do both, actually. So both is what I'm going to report in the next set of results. What happens when you do L1, L2 code mix data pre-training, continued pre-training, plus some fine-tuning with code mix data. Before I tell you the results, where do we get the data from, right? So now I need unlabeled data. As I said, ideally transcribed conversational speech is the best kind of data that we can hope for. Most natural code mix data. And this is what some of the data sets that are available. This is a little dated, 2019. I think a few more data sets would have come in between, but nevertheless, the state hasn't changed significantly. And you see the size, right? 54 conversations. And if you know, for you to move the needle, because MBERT or XLM Roberta is already trained on billions of tokens. To move, make it a little better, you at least need millions of tokens, right? If not billions of tokens from the domain. So this on to. Next best is text-based chat logs, like I again already mentioned, WhatsApp, Facebook conversations, Twitter conversations, etc. But I said there were privacy concerns. Getting large amount of data is a problem there. Twitter is still okay, but WhatsApp and Facebook definitely has a problem there. You could go to non-conversational data, like Twitter is mostly non-conversational. You could go to YouTube comments, Reddit comments, a lot of people have used them. Since these are non-conversational, the amount of code switching, the type is slightly bad. But at the end, this is the best real code mix data that we have, and that's what we are going to use, by the way. So we'll call this real code mix data. So let's say English in the mixed tweets. And there are some other kinds of data sets also which are interesting. We did a lot of work like movie scripts. Bollywood features a lot of code mixing these days. So you could look at Bollywood movie scripts, which are freely, which are available readily online. But these are also small, not really extensive, not in the order of millions, nowhere close to that. Okay, so some bit of real code mix data can be scraped from Twitter, let's say, or Reddit or YouTube comments, but that's not enough to move the. I will trust me here. I don't have the numbers for that, but if you just train with that data, do continued pre-training, it doesn't move the needle because you need a lot more data. What can you do? The question is, then can we generate artificially code mixed data? So one immediate thought could be like this, right? I take an English sentence, randomly switch some words to Hindi, or take or vice versa, or maybe I take some random English phrases and random Hindi phrases and put them together. Would it be okay? By the way, a lot of people have tried this. So people did try that, and sometimes that also shows a little bit of improvement, but that's very, clearly that's not natural. Here is a motivating example. Consider this English sentence: teacher has issued a book from the library for the student. And I'm assuming most of you know Hindi. Sorry if you don't know. So there are two sentences, right? Teacher ne library se student ke liye book issue ki, and teacher ne has issued library se student ke liye book. And if I ask you which one of these two is more natural, almost most bilingual, every bilingual Hindi English speaker says the first one. The first one is a very natural sentence. Teacher ne library se student ke liye booki shuki. The second one, most of them say unnatural. Some of them even don't accept. They say, no, this is not grammatical. I'll give you two more examples. I will go tomorrow. So that's the meaning of the sentence. And I'm code mixing it as I kal jaunga. How does it sound? Or main kal will go. How does it sound, right? Nobody will say this. Now, what is the linguistic constraint that we are talking about? If we can figure that out, maybe we can generate very natural looking code mix data, which looks like the first sentence here and not like the second one. So fortunately, linguists have worked on these problems for a long time, starting all the way from 1950s. There are tons and tons of theories, books written on it, but there are few theories. So people don't agree on the theory. So there are some 4 or 5 different theories. Interesting thing is all these theories start with similar kind of assumptions. So they start with a pair of aligned parallel sentences, and most of these theories are syntactic, so they require a parse tree. So if you have a aligned pair of sentences, and if you have parse trees, then you should be able to apply these theories. You could build models of these theories and implement them. So that's what we did. We tried implementing some of these models. Now for translation, we could use available translators like Bing, and you could also use available parallel data if there is a parallel corpus. And for parse trees, what we did for the English side, things are easy. There are very good parsers for English. You parse the English side and project it onto the other side, because these theories also require, alignable parse trees. So you have to you can project. So that sort of works for a lot of sentences. Okay. Now, I'm not going into the details of the theories because I don't have time. They are pretty fascinating, but I will give you a flavor of what these theories are and why, some of the previous examples that I showed just doesn't work. So let's say I have this sentence. She lives in a White House. The Spanish of this is Ella vive en una casa blanca. So in a White House, if you see, is equivalent of en una casa blanca. So what this says is, suppose you take the Spanish syntactic tree for, the syntactic tree for the Spanish sentence, and just replace this PP, prepositional phrase in Spanish by the prepositional phrase in English, the equivalent one, and you get a sentence like this: Ella vive in a White House, and that is a good code mix sentence. So if you can define syntactic transformations like this, that generates good sentences. Whenever you violate these rules, it generates bad sentences. There are more rules to it. For instance, you cannot do multiple switching. For instance, once you have switched this, you can't again switch white to blanca. So you can't say Ella vive in a blanca house. That is bad code mixing. Similarly, there are certain words which cannot be switched unless the whole phrase is switched. So in cannot be switched independently without switching this phrase, and so on and so forth. Pronouns cannot be switched. So there is a bunch of rules which linguists have worked out. And I just want to tell you that we tried a lot of these theories and modeled them and even tested them, with human judgment, which of the theories explain which of these languages. And what we found is matrix language theory is a little more, seems like a little more accurate for languages like English, Hindi. For Spanish, English kind of code mixing, where word order is more similar to each other, a lot of these theories are equally good. But when the word order is very different, like in English, Hindi, matrix language theory seems to generate better examples. That's an aside. We have some recent work on this. Yeah, but now again, back to the main storyline. So the problem here is when you are generating these sentences, right, from a aligned pair, there's a combinatorial explosion, because you see, I could swap this NP, I could swap this, I could swap this, I could swap a combination of them and so on. So this gives a combinatorial explosion. So if a sentence has, let's say, 18 words, it almost generates 4,000 aligned pairs. Now, if you take all these sentences and do continued pre-training, what would happen? It just screws up the system completely. Why it screws up the system completely? because you are completely ruining the natural distribution of sentences. For instance, if you do this, then the longer sentences become many times more probable than the shorter sentences in your model, which is very counterintuitive to what you see in a natural distribution. So that's not going to do. So we have to sample equal numbers from each, maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 5, but not more than that. So we also empirically validated that, around 5 samples per sentence pair works, no matter what's the length. But how do you sample? And it matters. Random sample doesn't help, actually. So you have to, again, go back to what is natural. And there are many theories that we could apply here. One way to think about it is how frequently you switch between the languages. And as you would imagine, in natural conversations, people don't usually say teacher ne library se student ke liye book ki shuki. That's, people don't make so many switches. So if you go with switch point based sampling, that gives you very good results, actually. There are other ways, like code mixing. Index is one measure of complexity. You could switch, sample based on that. There are more deeper things that one could do, syntactic and lexical signals and so on. So these are a little open-ended problems. So we haven't done any of these things. I mean, we have done some of these things, but haven't explored in detail. So this is an open area. But yeah, this is the thing. Number of switch point based sampling, that where we saw the maximal benefit. Okay, the last bit is training curriculum is also important. So when you are pre-training, so up to monolingual data is already trained, right? So this is the MBERT that you take. So after that, when you are doing, so remember I said you do have some real code mix data. So what happens, what works best is you do a few epochs of training with the code mixed, synthetic code mix data, and then finally one epoch with the real code mix data. That gives you the best accuracies, actually. There are many supporting experiments for several languages and several tasks that we have seen here. Now, finally coming to the results, does it help? So first, so here, let me first explain that the English in the column now is for the MBERT, so not the SOTA. We had already bitten the SOTA, so now it's the MBERT, vanilla MBERT result. And this is the modified MBERT, what I just talked about with pre-training and all. Now, can we do, is it better, this right column better than the left one? Let's look at Spanish English, right? Every task we are doing better. However, the delta is not very high. 66 to 69 is okay, but 93.33 to 93.62 is almost comparable. So the delta is small. In Hindi, it's a little more complicated. Out of 7, 5 tasks we are doing good. Some like NER, we are doing pretty good, 4% better. However, some tasks like, here, the QA, we are doing even a little worse. And in fact, if you look at the monolingual performance for some of these cases, you are also doing a little worse, which is not acceptable. Your model should not regress on monolingual performance, right? So somehow it's helping, but not to the extent that we would want it to. So that is the thing to remember. With the Hindi case, I can further explain you a little bit. The problem is Hindi in natural setting, when Hindi and English is code mixed and typed, it's often Romanized, not in Devanagari. You don't type Hindi in Devanagari, you Romanize, like the examples I was showing in Latin characters. So the problem is when we actually generate with Devanagari characters, because we take parallel data. So parallel data is English is in Latin and Hindi is in Devanagari, and when you do generated code switch sentences, you have Latin Devanagari, Hindi remains in Devanagari. So there is a mismatch there as well. We tried doing something for that, but I think that's one factor which shows that Hindi, we have a little kind of, not a very systematic result like Spanish. But from both together, it's kind of clear that it's helping. It's helping, but we can do better. And definitely the absolute scores are nowhere there. There's plenty of room for improvement, and we should be able to do better. Now, what should we do, right? So I already talked through this. So we say that we see that continued pre-training is helping monolingual performance. There's a big gap from monolingual performance still. But what is interesting is with bigger and better multilingual models, like this was MBERT. With XLM Robota, the deltas become even smaller. And when you go to Turing or MT5, your deltas become even smaller, sometimes no delta at all. So it's like, the models are already so good that you can't do much better with synthetically generated code mix data. However, at the same time, there is room for improvement. So there is a big gap here, it seems. So what should we do, or how can what could be a solution? I'm not going to give a solution for this. This is a problem I'm going to leave you with. But before we end up, right, let me try to talk about this very interesting. I mean, personally, I find this question very interesting. What really happens to MBERT when we do continued pre-training with code mix data? We saw that it's helping for English, Spanish, even for English, Hindi. But what's happening? What is changing in MBERT fundamentally? So there was this recent work we had. It's called BERTologicoMix. Many of you might have read the book called Logicomix, fascinating book, graphic novel. You should, if you haven't, on computer science. So we made a pun on it. So BERTologicoMix, when Bertology meets code mixing. So how do you check, what happens to BERT? There are two ways of checking it. One is, treating BERT as black box and doing probing. And second is looking inside MBERT. So the paper describes a lot of experiments, but let me just tell you two interesting and insightful results. The first is a black box experiment. So when in the left graph, right, I take vanilla MBERT without any pre-training. Here, fine-tuning actually means pre-training. So without any further continued pre-training with code mixing. And remember, I can generate multiple versions, code mix versions of the same sentence pair. So I'm putting, plotting, this is a TSNE plot of the embeddings of, so one color means they all come from the same base pair sentences. So ideally, they mean exactly the same, these points. But you see the points are scattered. Some pink points are here, some pink points are here. Some red points are here, some red points are here, and so on. What happens is when you do continued pre-training, you get very neat clusters. Somehow the model is better able to process code mixed inputs now. So all the blue points are together, all the red points are together. So that is a fundamental change happening. Now, what is interesting, this data is for English, Spanish, but I had done continued pre-training with English, Hindi. So we don't even need English in Spanish code mix data to bring out this character, even with any language, right? So it's getting code mixing as a phenomenon rather than a so-called domain adaptation. Like it's not only for English, Hindi, it's generalizing to any language pair. So that's what was fascinating, that yes, it is learning something interesting. Now the question then would be then, looking inside BERT and what is fundamentally changing there. It's very hard. We looked at lots of signals and stuff. And one thing which I think has some promise, holds some promise of what's happening is what we call responsivity of attention head to code mixing. I'll explain in a bit. So there are 12 layers on BERT in BERT that we used and another 12 attention heads, right? So 12 cross 12, each means an attention head from a layer. So that's this heat map. And there are 4 experimental conditions. This is vanilla MBERT. This is MBERT with, remember I told you lexical switching, just randomly switch some words. So this is that model. This is generated code mix data. So MBERT with continued pre-training with generated code mix data. And this is real code mix data. We are pre-training with real code mix data. So there are 4 conditions. And this is the heat map of what? So we are plotting here responsivity. Responsivity is when each head, when my input is a code mix sentence, what is the excitation of this particular attention head versus when it is not a code mix sentence. So it is measured in an information gain sort of thing. So you can imagine, like if I were to classify based on these attention weights, I were to classify whether the input was a code mix sentence or not, this is the weight that a classifier will put on them. So that's how to think about it. So if you think of this plain vanilla MBERT, right, there are these 2-3 heads which are paying a lot of attention to code mixing. Whenever there is code mixing, they just light up. But otherwise, it's not, the other things are all well distributed. Whereas if you see when you do these last 2, right, MBERT and generated with MBERT and plus real and MBERT plus generated. So the highlights are much more distributed, as if more neurons or these attention heads are now paying attention, are now becoming sensitive to code switching. So it one way to argue that is when it is distributed, it is more robust feature, right? So now the system becomes much more robust to code switching. It understands, it can process code switching in a much more robust way. This right-hand curves actually show the same thing. It shows, the distribution of the values of this, graph or the heat map. So the wider the distribution, the more distributed it is, right? So you see here the distribution is peaky, and here it becomes more wider. So the effect of training with further continued pre-training with code mix data makes it wider. So essentially more heads become responsive to code mixing. So, but these are very early experiments, and I think there's a lot that we can do here. And finally, one last question we could ask is, since code mixing can impart so many interesting properties to, these multi-language models, could code mixing then be used for training large-scale multilingual systems instead of, or along with parallel data, monolingual independent corpora? So this is again another avenue which is not very well explored, and I think people can look at it. So let me conclude. By saying a couple of things. First is, we already noted that there's a big gap between desirable and achievable performance for code mix tasks. It still exists. It still exists with all the work that we did. We are improving, but it exists. Second is we need data. We need more data. And when I say this, it's not only monolingual data we need, but also code mixed data for most languages. Now, this is important. I'm emphasizing this monolingual data because the results I showed all were for English Hindi and English Spanish. Now we are working on English Swahili, and things are pathetic. The embedded accuracies are no better than a random classifier accuracy. So this was a work in ACL 2020 where we talked about how the resource is distributed across various languages in the world. And if you look at the 0, 1, 2 classes, they of languages, 88% of world's languages spoken very little digital presence and resources in even these massive models. So we really can't process anything using the modern techniques for these languages. Glucose and Lindsay are good, right? Test benches are good start. I think we need to expand on that because there is enough evidence. After a lot of experimentation, I think I strongly believe that these data sets are also skewed and biased depending on how people collected the data. Some of these data sets have certain kinds of sociolinguistic biases, some have syntactic biases, and so on and so forth. So we need more extensive and good test benches for code mixing. And last is, the topic of this talk, that linguistic techniques help in generating data, and there's a lot of scope for improvement here, because the sampling I talked about, for instance, was switch point based. I'm sure we can do much better if we, sample based on the lexical and semantic constraints people have. Just to give an example, drink, that word when used in a Hindi context, wo bahut drink karta hai, really means he's an alcoholic. Really doesn't, the interpretation can never be that this person drinks a lot of soft drink, right? So meaning changes when you do code mixing. So these things have to be captured by the models. We don't capture this. Our models don't capture this. So of course, either you have a lot of data or you have better linguistic models. These are the two options that one has. Okay, so talk sunne ke liye thank you again. And here is a small, advertisement. At MSR India, we are hiring at all levels. So researcher levels, engineers, and if you want to work on this kind of exciting problems in NLP and more broadly ML and AI, please, send emails to me or my colleagues or visit our website. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk. I think we have a lot of questions here. So for the interest of time, I will just pick 3. So the first one is, in constructing synthetic code mix data, can we make a simple assumption, say Hindi speakers use English words as noun? Is there any existing work on this? That is, which pause tag is commonly code switched?
Yeah. So intuitively, Hindi speakers, or not only Hindi speakers, intuitively when a pair of languages are code switched, nouns are the first categories which are changed to the other language. A verb comes much later, and there are more constraints on verbs. However, adverbs also get code switched very often, and discourse markers get code switched very often. So you would have heard, I was telling him, "Ki, don't come here." So here that key is a discourse connector, equivalent of English that, right? And it's an extremely common thing that in Indian English people do. So nouns are common worldwide. Then there are language pair specific idiosyncrasies. We recently did a work on this with IIT Hyderabad. I was working on this problem exactly. I can't tell more because that's under submission.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question is, I heard sentences like "wait, I will bhagao him" previously was unnatural to me, being normalized in the movies, etc. now. How do we define the rules when the forms of code mixing seem to be constantly evolving? Where do we draw the line?
Very interesting question, and whoever has asked, thanks for the question. So I remember I was looking at, like I told you, when we tried applying the linguistic theories, we saw that they don't explain a lot of phenomena that we are observing. So one of the theories, right, metrics language theory. So Professor Arvind Joshi, very well-known, researcher in the NLP and cognitive science community. So he had done one of the first papers, a parser for code switch languages using this matrix language theory. And I was telling him in one of the conferences that, look, Professor Joshi, some of these things that you have written in your paper doesn't hold anymore. I mean, I didn't say it doesn't hold anymore. I said doesn't hold, because this is what I observe. And his answer was exactly the same thing, that when I worked on it 20 years ago, code mixing was different, and today code mixing is different. In fact, code mixing varies by geography also. So in our lab, Kalika from Delhi has a much more, what should I say? She's much more open to this kind of constructs than, let's say, I am, because first of all, I'm not a native Hindi speaker, but I'm a near native Hindi speaker. But I have very low tolerance for this kind of, patawing, magawing, and all these kinds of constructs, because I haven't heard. So that also. So there is geographical variation and there is temporal variation, and that makes it very hard. We really don't want to draw lines. We want to serve everybody. And the question is then, how do you rapidly collect data and keep making your systems evolve as well?
Yeah. So the last question I will take, why are the languages clustering when the loss function actually is trying to use MLM loss on code mix data? Intuitively, It should go the opposite way, making the model less sensitive to the language and prioritizing more on semantics.
Right. So again, thanks for asking this question. I forgot to mention that we don't use contrastive loss here. So you are right. We only use MLM. We don't. If we had used contrastive loss, right, then we would have forced it to cluster. So we are not using contrastive loss. So we are just using MLM. Now somehow so this is my intuition. So when you take 5 sentences or 10 sentences which are generated from the same pair, the bulk of the sentence will look similar, right? And parts will be different. And when you do a MLM with these kind of things, the chances are that the model will learn more that they have the same semantics. So this is exactly what you mentioned. So it should go with more semantics, and that's what is happening. These sentences mean exactly the same thing, right? Semantically, they are identical. So it is getting better in semantics only, but along the dimension of code mixing also.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. For the interest of time, I'm not taking any more questions here. So now we move to our last talk for this session by Professor Dragomir R. Radev. Dragomir Radev is the A. Bartlett Giamatti Professor of Computer Science at Yale University. He leads the Natural Language Processing Lab at Yale University. His research focuses on computational models for natural language understanding and generation, as well as their applications. He is one of the co-founders of the North American Computational Linguistics Open Competition. He is fellow of ACM, AAAI, AAAS, and ACL. Today, he will be presenting his talk on closing the loop in natural language interfaces to databases, parsing, dialogue, and generation. Over to you, Drew.
Hi, everybody. Can I please ask you to check if there's some noise coming from somewhere, a lot of background noise?
It might be from my side.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Okay, so let me share my screen, make sure everything is okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good, very good. So I'm going to start in just 1 second. Okay, so can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
all fine.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much for inviting me. I was very happy to be able to attend some of the presentations so far, and I can say that this is a very nice workshop with a lot of very interesting people saying very interesting things. So as you just heard, I am a professor at Yale University, and I lead here the Language Information and Learning Lab, which is this LILI. If you're interested in our other papers and other work, you can always go to our website. We have a lot of interesting demos, and in particular, a lot of data sets and software on GitHub. I will mention some of it in today's presentation, but there's a lot more that may be of interest to different groups of you. So what I'm going to talk about today is how we use natural language processing to close the loop in natural language interfaces to relational databases. And this is joint work with a large number of people, and I would particularly want to cite 3 of them. Those are PhD students in our lab. 2 of them recently finished their PhDs, and 1 is still here, and also a lot of our collaborators from industry and from other universities. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? Natural language interfaces to structured data. So as you know, we have data in many different forms, many different genres. So that can be anything from very structured data like databases. It can also be in the form of knowledge graphs. It can be web pages and tables, which are a little bit less structured. They contain a lot of free text. And then finally, it can be something completely unstructured like text and images and videos. There has been a lot of interesting work in NLP for each of those different genres of text. Today, I'm going to focus more on the things on the left, so the first 3 of those, and I'm going to show you how we have designed several systems and several interesting data sets that can handle interesting problems for each of those 3 types of data. So very quickly, what is a natural language interface to a relational database? What you see here are SQL or SQL statements that give you answers for many different questions. Of course, we don't expect our users to understand SQL to be able to ask questions like this. So instead, what we want to do is to make sure that everybody should be able to talk to the database in their natural language. So instead of giving the SQL query, they should be able to say, how many units of this particular item are available in stock. So the text-to-SQL problem is about translating natural language sentences with or without context, maybe or not part of a dialogue, using some sort of a database as the backend, and then combining those 2 to form queries that can be executed on the database, and then possibly returning the results back to the user either in the form of a table or in natural language. So this is the main point of today's talk. So I'm going to discuss how we do understand the user. So that includes things like semantic parsing and text-to-SQL processing. In particular, I'm going to focus on our paper from 2018 on the Spider data set. Then we're going to talk about understanding the data. So we have done some interesting work on language modeling for tables, so specifically training on tables and the text surrounding them. And then finally, in order to close the loop, we're going to talk a little bit about structure to text or data to text generation, and also question answering and summarization over tables. So all of this together allows us to have some sort of a closed loop, which can be exploited in a dialogue setting. Okay, so let me show you first why table semantic parsing and text to SQL is a challenging problem. Suppose that we have a database that consists of those three tables. So one is about tennis matches, one is about ranking of players, and the final one is about the players themselves. So suppose that the user asks a question like this one: which European countries have some players who won the Australian Open at least 3 times? Now, in order to answer this question, you have to do at least 2 things. One is to understand the meaning of this sentence, which is typically done using semantic parsing. And then second, you have to execute this query on the database and then return the results. So the semantic parser does the first part. It will look at the table and then convert this user question into a valid SQL statement that can be executed. And if something is unclear, if it needs more context, or if there's some sort of an error, then it should be able to go back to the user and ask some follow-up questions. So once you have this query, you have to execute it on this data set. But even before then, you still have to worry about a lot of little things which make the whole process fairly complicated and hard to solve. So, for example, in order to get this answer here, Switzerland, you have to be able to combine information from each of those tables using database joins and other operators. So one of those things requires you to understand what are the meanings of the cells in the table. So for example, you need to know that Australian Open refers to the name of a tournament. European here refers to another value of the cell, which is the location of the different tournaments. Another piece of the input text, like countries and won in this case, map to column names like winner ID and nation in this particular case. Then in blue, you also have table names. So the word player here is not associated with any particular cell or row or column of those tables, but rather associated with the entire table. And then finally, you also have some logic snippets, which are also interesting and very important to parse properly. So in this case, this purple text here, at least 3 times, will have to be converted into this SQL code here, group by winner ID, and then you want to make sure that the count in each of those categories for each of the winners' IDs is greater than or equal to 3. So now I'm going to introduce our first paper in this sequence. Sorry. So this is a paper from Nlp 2018, which started our project. And the first author of this paper is Tao Yu, whose PhD was on the topic of semantic parsing for databases. So Spider is currently the largest and most popular data set for text to SQL that involves multiple tables. It was created over multiple months by more than 10 graduate students in our lab, and it contains 10,000 questions in natural language, which were created from scratch, not through any automatic grammar or generation. Those correspond to 6,000 unique SQL queries and also 200 different databases. So unlike previous data sets, we were able to cover a fairly wide range of databases in many different domains, in this case, 138. So one interesting property of this data set is that it has a large number of what we call complex questions. And those complex questions have the following database correspondences. So one of them is that they contain multiple tables with foreign keys and are joined together. And then you also have aggregate commands in SQL, for example, minimum, maximum, and average, group by, having, and so on. And finally, we also have a lot of questions that have nested queries, like the examples on the previous slide. So this data set is available on our website. I'll show you some links at the end. And we have a leaderboard where people can submit their results on the development test. And we can also secretly score them on the test set, which is not publicly available. So as you can see, this was a fairly large task to build this data set. The total amount spent was about 1,000 hours, but it paid off because this data set has been extremely helpful, not just for our own research, but as you will see, for many other people's research. So this annotation process involves several steps. For example, we had to collect databases first, then we had to build the questions, write SQL annotations. We also had to review the SQL statement, so the person different from the person who wrote the SQL statement verified that this is correct. We also made sure that they can be executed properly on the database itself. We also did some paraphrasing in order to augment the data set from about 8,000 to for more than 11,000. So we have about 3,000 additional paraphrases of existing questions. And then we also did a lot of additional final review of all the sequels and for consistency and for diversity of question types and so on. So each of those things took a lot of time. As you can see, some of those took 500 person hours, 150 person hours, and so on. So the quality control was done also over a fairly long period of time. We looked in particular for things like SQL pattern coverage, make sure that we cover all the different SQL statements that we're interested in, and that each of the tables in the database appears in at least one query, that we have a certain percentage of nested queries, that if there are multiple equivalent SQL queries, that we cover all of them as much as possible, and that also the natural language questions are as clear as possible and as natural as possible. So when we published this data set, which again was about 3 years ago, it was, and it still is, the largest data set for multi-table databases. As you can see, it has a smaller number of questions and SQL queries than compared to WikiSQL, which was an earlier data set created by Salesforce and some other institutions. But we are the first one to have a very large number of databases with multiple tables and all of those different special statements. So one of the things that we did with this data set is to split the questions into 4 different categories based on complexity or hardness. So some of them were easy, like this one here. Then we have medium, hard, and very hard. And then when we report results on this work, we always group the performance in each of those 4 different categories in order to understand whether a particular new method is more appropriate for very simple queries, or maybe it gives us some additional mileage for the really hard ones, like the ones that have nested queries and aggregate statements. So as part of this project, we also built a couple of different systems. One is called TypeSQL, and one of them is called Syntax SQLnet. Both of those were published in 2018. In both of them, we looked at different ways in which we can transform the natural language questions into parse trees, and then from parse trees to SQL commands. So here's an interesting slide. I just pulled this a few hours ago from the Spider leaderboard. As you can see here, when we started this project, we were getting a very low performance. So on the dev set, something like 8%, 10%, and then the test set about the same performance. And then over the years, we have received a large number of submissions, and the performance has gone up, slowly over the years, from 10%, 36%, and so on, until a couple of months ago when we now have performance that is in the 70s. So fairly large number of participants here. Some of those are still anonymous because the papers haven't been published, but as soon as the paper gets published, we update the leaderboard and we de-anonymize those entries. So this data set is available on the Spider website, and you can download the code and also the data from there. So Spider, as I mentioned before, has been very popular. It was one of the shared tasks at the workshop on interactive and executable semantic parsing last year at the Nlp 2020, which also involved a large number of participants and a large number of invited speakers. It was translated in several other languages, starting with Chinese in 2019. And it has become very popular. We've had more than 100 submissions from top research labs, pretty much most of the main players in this field in the last 3 years. And then finally, it has also led to about 40 publications in the top AI, machine learning, NLP, and database conferences like iClear, AAAI, VLDB, and so on. So one thing that a little bit relates to what Monojit was saying a little bit earlier is that there's a big gap in performance over the years from the so-called Word2Vec era up until around 2018 and then some early 2019 papers. So you can see the performance here is very low, less than 50% set match accuracy. And then once BERT became popular, we had a big jump throughout all the participants, including our submissions and also other people's submissions. So this one is one of ours, this one is one of ours at the beginning, this one, and also this one here, which use different sorts of transformers. Okay, So once we finished working with Spider and we popularized it, we started discussing different ways in which we can enhance it so that we can have a dialogue system and also to generate output in natural language from the query results. So the first data set that we created after Spider was called Spark, which is about dialogue versions of SQL. So for example, we have here a database and the user asks questions like find the names of the students who live in a dorm that have TV lounges. And then this is converted into a SQL query. And then the user is allowed to ask additional questions, which then can be answered in SQL format in the context of the previous questions. So we have created a set of dialogues of this sort where each additional SQL query has to be evaluated separately from the history so far. So here's an example of our data sizes. So Spark was compared to the existing data sets. As you can see, there's a big improvement here in terms of the coverage. So we have context, just like some of the other data sets here, but this is all based on databases. And it is also cross-domain, which is what the previous systems did not have in this domain. And then in terms of size, it is also fairly large. It has 4,000 sequences over 200 databases compared to just one domain in the very classic, very old 80s data set in airline reservation. So Spark, just like Spider, includes a lot of different SQL syntactic statements. So for example, it has a large number of aggregate commands and also nested queries. It is also cross-domain. So we have 140 databases for training, 20 for development, and 40 for testing. So this is the leaderboard for Spark. As you can see, we keep getting very good submissions. The performance has gone up just over the last year and a half from 48% to 65% of the question match evaluation. We also have a website where you can download the code and the data. And again, we have some statistics that compare Cosecal with some of the other data sets, which are used in this particular case for dialogue state tracking, like the DSTC challenges and the multi-was challenges. Okay, so I'm going to skip a few slides here, and I'm going to switch to the third data set that we created, and this is called the Cosecal data set. So this is about SQL-grounded dialogue state tracking, which was also released in 2019, and it also has been very actively developed over the years. We went here from a performance very low, less than 15% to 53% over a year and a half. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about understanding the contents of the table without the context of user questions. In particular, I'm going to talk about a system called Grappa, which was published recently a few months ago in ICLR 2021. And this system is about grammar augmented pre-training for table semantic parsing. Or in other words, we are training a language model that specifically understands the content of tables. And by content of tables, I mean both the metadata, for example, the parts of the schema, such as types of the data types, the column headers, the number of rows in the table, and so on, the table title, but also the data itself. So this is trained on tables that don't just have a schema, but they also have actual data records in them. So let me explain how we do this. So traditional language models such as BERT and Roberta and most of the others have been extremely successful in many different natural language processing tasks. Everybody has been talking about this in the previous presentation. So GLUE came up earlier today. So most of the performers in the last 2 years have been using different variants of those pre-trained language models to get the highest performance, which in some cases is even higher than human performance. However, most of those language models are trained on text. So for example, Wikipedia articles, again, not structured data, just plain sentences. A lot of them are trained on books, including the original BERT model and many others. Now, in table semantic parsing, we also need to be able to encode the tables and to jointly understand the questions on the tables and also figure out some logic operations. Like in our case, it was at least 3 times. So in order to do this, we have to train the model not just on plain text, but also on the table and their context. So there has been work on this before us. There are 2 papers from 2020 that I would like to cite by Yin et al. And Herzig et al., which train language models on millions of text table examples extracted from the web. Those are very noisy examples because they have the table, let's say from a Wikipedia page, and then the surrounding sentences, which may or may not match the contents of that table exactly. They may be about some other table, or they may even be not included in the tables at all. So here's an example of the data that is used to train those models. So you have a table from Wikipedia, and then you also have the surrounding text, like median age of the population. As you can see from this example, there is some interesting overlap between the contents of the table and the surrounding text, but most of the overlap is not there. You really don't have enough information in the text surrounding the table to describe the contents. So this is one of the challenges that we have to address. Here's one more example of this. So this is very noisy, as I mentioned, and it's not ideal. So one of the things that we tried to do first was to do some data augmentation. Everybody knows what data augmentation is. It has been used in a lot of papers in the past. For example, Jia and Liang used a synchronous context-free grammar to create recombinant examples. There's been also earlier work and also more recent work on this kind of data augmentation. And then in another piece of work, we have people like Hertzig and Berandt and Andreas Campagna and so on, which also created this kind of augmentation using the table specifically. Well, it turned out that even though we were expecting to get higher improvement of the performance using this kind of data augmentation, we actually did not get any additional performance improvement. So when we evaluated the model on Spider, Spark, and Cosecal, we actually saw that the performance with synthetic training data is about the same, and on Spider, it's like 4% lower than without the synthetic training data. And the same thing also applies, again, as you can see, drop, and here pretty much a dead heat between the two methods on the multi-was data set. So this is like a speech dialogue data set. So instead, what we decided to do is we decided to pre-train by injecting a compositional inductive bias in the joint representations of the textual and the tabular data to the language model. So in particular, we have our original annotated text to SQL examples, which we created in the previous data sets. We have 340,000 high quality databases from Wikipedia. And then we also created a large number of synthetic text to SQL examples, and we wanted to combine all this information to train the model in a better way. So we developed by hand a synchronous context-free grammar that takes into account the structure of the query. So you have values for tables and columns, and also different aggregate operators and nested queries and so on. And then each of those rules is built from some pair of input and output from the databases, and we replace all the terminal phrases with non-terminal so that we can have better generalization and be not domain dependent. Okay, so in order to do the pre-training, we ended up with two objective functions. One is column contextual semantics, that's CCS in this context here. And also we use something called turn contextual switch, or TCS. I'm going to explain how this works in a moment. So the input consists of questions and then the matching tables. And then you transform each of those into a sequence. You encode them in the form of a sequence, and then use a BERT encoder in order to get the result. So pre-training a grappa is done by pre-training Roberta or BERT in different experiments on the synthetic data using those SQL semantic prediction objectives. So the way that this works is that you give it as input the question, and then also the masked version of the sentence with the converted words. And then you compute this SQL semantic prediction loss on the Roberta output. Now, in addition to this objective function, we also use masked language modeling as an additional objective, and then we combine the two together to get better performance. So this is done both on the questions from the tables and also on the synthetic text to SQL examples. So we combine the loss, the masked language model loss, with the SQL semantic prediction. Okay, then we decided to evaluate this model on 4 different tasks. 2 of them on the left are fully supervised semantic parsing tasks. Those are Spider and WikiSQL. Again, WikiSQL is about single tables, and Spider is about multiple tables joined together. So by fully supervised, what that means is that we have the database itself, we have the natural language question, and we also have the SQL command that is used as output in the training set. Now, on the right-hand side in blue, you see the second settings, which is about the weakly supervised problem. So those are semantic parsing tasks on wiki table questions and wiki SQL, but in a different environment. In this case, we have a table, in this particular case, a single table, but we don't have the SQL code itself. We just have the answer. So we have to learn without the latent SQL query that would give us the answer. So this is very similar to many other semantic parsing papers in like from Percy Liang and many other people. Okay, so here's what the data sets look like. We have Spider, fully supervised wiki SQL, wiki table questions, weekly supervised wiki SQL. In each of those cases, you have either like annotations and the different questions and database sizes. So I'm going to show you some results here. First on the Spider data set. So the Spider data set, as you know, is one of ours, and people at that time, this is done mid-2020, we were able to compare with SOTA at the time. At that point in time, the best performance was using RAT SQL. And as you can see, if you add the Grappa model using the masked language model objective, we get a performance improvement of 1.4. And then if you add the two different objectives, then we get a bigger improvement in performance, about 3.7 to 4% on the test. Now, the next data set is fully supervised wiki SQL. So in fully supervised wiki SQL, again, we get using both of those objectives, we get a performance improvement of 2 to 3%. But this is done on a relatively small number of training examples, just 10K. So not the entire data set. So this was done in order to show that we have a robust system that can be trained with fewer data points. We were also getting an improvement even on the full data set, but that one was not as large as the one with a smaller number of shots. Then the next data set that we evaluated on is called wiki table questions. And again, here we have a nice improvement in performance on the order of 8 percentage points for the combined pre-training objective. And also on the smaller data set, we also have some reasonable 3 to 4% improvement. Now, the third data set is weekly supervised SQL. And as you can see here, we have even more substantial improvement with the two pre-training objectives. We get 6.58, 5.4 percentage improvement using Wang et al. 2019 as the baseline. So some interesting observations about Grappa. So first about generalization. So Grappa was not specifically trained on a corpus that is optimized for the Spider data distribution, but it is still able to perform well when it's trained on one of those, but tested on completely different data sets like wiki SQL and wiki table questions. And then in terms of pre-training, we were actually able to do this very fast compared to Tabert and Tapas, the models by Yin et al. And Herzig et al. Some of them were trained for 6 days on 100 GPUs and one on 32 TPUs, whereas in our case, we were only able to train Grappa with 300,000 steps on 8 16-gigabyte NVIDIA GPUs. Okay. So now the next thing that I want to mention is some more recent work from NACO 2021. This is the so-called DART data set. So this is about table to text generation. So just to remind you where we are in this process, we are trying to close the loop. We started with semantic parsing and then execution models that are trained on the contents of databases. Now we're going to the second half of this loop. This is the generation and summarization side. So one interesting slide that I got from Sasha Rush a few months ago is that on the generation side, there's a lot of interesting tasks that people work on. So on one end is a very abstractive, high conditional entropy generation model, for example, class conditional generation, the kind of things that you get from pre-trained language models like GPT-3. And then on the other side, you have something that is very source determined with low conditional entropy. So when you do translation, you want the output to be semantically equivalent to the input as much as possible. And then there's another step here in this continuum that is data to text, where we have an input that is very strictly specified. So you want to capture the contents of a table or maybe a semantic representation like AMR or something represented in the form of RDF triples on RDF tree. But you want the output to match as much as possible the content, to be faithful to this original. So this is this part of the continuum where we have worked for this paper. So let's look at an example here. You have a table of cars and their few efficiencies. So those are different models like 2014 Chevy Spark, which has a fuel efficiency of 119 miles per gallon, again, higher in city, lower in highway, and so on and so forth. And now you want to be able to ask questions like this: which cars get more than 100 miles per gallon? Now, as we saw before, if you do text to SQL translation, you can just move this into a SQL statement like select name, year, and so on, which will, once executed on the table, is going to result in this table here that tells you that there are actually 4 cars that have this kind of mileage, and in particular, one of them that has the best mileage, which is this Nissan Leaf. Now, on the generation side, you may want to get the list of the cars that have more than 100 miles per gallon. That's very easy. You can just list them. But you also want to be able to generate sentences on the output so that the user doesn't have to look at tables, especially if the tables are very long, or if you have some sort of a spoken audio environment where showing tables may not be feasible. So in this particular case, we want to be able to take as input the row at the bottom, the 4th record, and to generate a grammatical sentence that is also faithful to the original input. In particular, we want to say that the 2013 Nissan Leaf electric vehicle gets 102 miles per gallon. So just like in the semantic parsing problem, some of the words here map to different columns, like for example, year, some map to values of the table, some map to the entire table, and some map to words that may not even be in the table itself. They may be in some description. For example, here, miles per gallon does not show up in the table itself, but it is in the metadata for the table, either in the title or in the description of the table. So when we started working on this, the total data set, which was published before our paper, was not available. So we started creating a data set from scratch. So this data set is called DART. And the way we did it is the following. We started with Wikitable questions and Wikitables in particular. And then we asked our human annotators, both internal annotators like students in the lab, but also a large number of crowdsourcing workers on Mechanical Turk. We ask them to perform the following task. We give them a table, and then we say, okay, say something interesting about this table and specify which cells of the table and possibly which parts of the metadata is used, or are used rather, to generate that sentence. So in this case, we have a table about football, like American-style football stadiums in Europe. And in this case, you have the middle record here that talks about a team based in the Netherlands who plays on Olympisch Stadion, and that stadium was opened in 1928. So we highlight those cells, and then we write a sentence that describes the content of those cells. So we found out that in addition to the data in the table itself, we also have to take into account the metadata. So like, for example, the title of the table, the column headers, and so on. But also more interestingly, we had to convert the entire metadata of the tables into a tree so that we can see which attribute depends on which other attribute in a database sense. So for example, a city is a property of a team and a stadium is a property of a team. But capacity is a property of stadium and open is also a property of stadium. So we cannot directly associate capacity to team. So one of the things that we had to do was to convert those tables into a tree representation, again, that has a richer database inheritance structure and dependency structure. So once we have this, then we can extract triples. Those are what I call the RDF triples. So this is a standard semantic representation in the semantic web context. So we create triples that correspond to the content of the record that we want to summarize. And then we combine those triples into a tree, which is fully connected. So then I'm going to skip a few slides here, but we went to an extensive data collection stage. We went through some of the more domain-specific data sets, such as E2E and WikiSQL, which are two of the standard evaluation data sets for this kind of data-to-text problem. But again, they're fairly domain-specific. And then we also started from Wikitable questions, which is about very domain-independent examples. So we ended up collecting a data set that contains 82,000 what we call darts. So each dart is essentially a tree of RDF triples. I'm going to show you some examples of those. Here, so here's one dart. So this one has two triples. William Findlater took office. This is the predicate in 1915, and this person's party was the Liberal Party. And then when you combine those two RDF triples into a RDF tree, you can get a sentence that describes the content of the entire tree. In this case, William Findlater, a liberal, took office in 1915. So this is a relatively small Dart that has 2 triples, whereas we can go as high as 8 in many of the cases. So we have here an example with 6. And what is interesting to show here is that some of those triples refer to some of the metadata. So for example, in this case, we refer to the table context and also to the table title as metadata points. How much time do I have?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few more interesting projects that we have been working on. So the Dart data set again was published, but as usually happens, with some interesting projects, we were beaten by the total data set, which was larger than ours, but was developed in a very different way. So they were starting from existing sentences in Wikipedia pages that are near the tables, and then ask human annotators to simplify them and to clean them up, whereas we started completely from scratch. So we gave the annotators the tables without any context and asked them to write sentences from there. So this provides for an opportunity for evaluating future systems on 2 very different types of data sets, even though their format, data to text, is generally the same. Okay, so now I'm going to show you one other thing that we've been working on. So this is table summarization. This is an ongoing project. So one of the examples that I showed you earlier was about generating a sentence from a single record. Now what we want to do is to be able to generate a summary of the entire table. So for example, in this case, we want to say that 4 vehicles get more than 100 miles per gallon. Then possibly if you want the summary to be longer, you may also want to include the names or the models of the different cars that have this kind of mileage. Okay. So in order to do this, we again started creating a data set. Again, this is our specialty, creating large manually annotated data sets. So one of them starts again from Wikitable questions. And then we ask people to read each of those tables. We limited them to tables that have fewer than 15 records so that we can manage, from a cognitive point of view, the data set. And then ask people to write summary sentences for the entire table. So by summary sentences, we mean 2 different things. One is in the context of a specific user question, and the other one is in the context of no question, in which case we want to identify automatically either what is called in the database community insights, or to find something that is generally true about the entire table, not just about some separate part of it. Okay, so then once we have those summaries, we asked human annotators to go through all those examples and to give us some score of the quality of the summary, how informative it is, how much it covers the most important points of the input, how grammatical it is, and so on. Okay, so I'm going to skip a few slides here, very quickly mention one other project. So this was a paper recently accepted by TACO. It may appear by the end of this year, more likely to appear in 2022. This is called the FETA QA dataset, and it's about free-form table question answering. So quickly, an example here is again a Wikipedia table, German submarine U-60 from 1939. Then you have a table, and then you have a region of the table that you want to refer to, and then a question that has to get a specific answer produced from this particular region. So here we have a question, a region, and then an answer, which is based on information from the table. So again, we have collected a large number of such data points. Right now we have a total of 10,000 tables, and you can see we have 7,000 questions for training and another 3,000, so total of 10,000 total training, dev, and test. Okay, so let me skip a couple of slides here and get to the final slide. So in this presentation, I tried to show you some recent work over the last 3 years in the Lilly Lab at Yale on closing the loop in natural language interfaces to databases. We started first by creating a cleaned up large text-to-SQL data set. And then we moved on to dialogue data sets, to a language model for tables, generation from tables, and table-based question answering. And we're currently working on the summarization part, which hopefully will result in a paper in the near future. So those are some of the papers that I cited here. When I share my slides, you should be able to click on those links. And then I want to thank everybody for your attention. I in particular also want to thank the co-authors, starting with Tao Yu, again, the PhD student who finished recently. He moved since then to Hong Kong University as an assistant professor. His name is Tao Yu, and then all of our other collaborators. So our lab's URL is shown here. And I again want to thank everybody for your attention and for inviting me for this talk.
Thank you, Drago, for this wonderful talk. We have a couple of questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Gautam, would you like to ask the question to the speaker?
Yeah, hi, Drago Gautam Shroff here. We met many years back in Yale.
I remember.
Yeah, so you about the accuracies. So you said the exact match accuracy is around say 70%, and the execution accuracy was like 40%. But I mean, it's a little confusing. If the exact matches are correct, then why would the execution suffer? Or is there something that I'm not understanding how this is computed?
Let me see if I understand the question. Is this the one you have on the screen, right?
No. At the very beginning in the spider, the exact match accuracy on the SQL statement was around 70%, but the match for execution accuracy, that the values are correct or not, was like 40%. So why is there a gap?
I'm not sure I really understand the question. Do you mind if I answer it offline?
Okay, no problem. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, thank you.
There is another question. T5 explores the limit of pretend models with 10 billion parameters, but soon the record was broken by GPT-3 model with 175 billion parameters, which has a good performance under the few shot or even zero shot setting. Afterwards, switch to transformer, it proposed as the world's first trillion parameter pretend language model. Where this will end, what about common sense reasoning? All these datasets measure in English. What about other languages?
Okay, that is a really good question. Yeah, thank you. So multiple answers here. So first of all, there are now again trillion parameter language models which take months of GPU time to train, very expensive, obviously. So very few people can afford to build those. Now, in terms of common sense reasoning, I believe that the current models, as we know, GPT-3 has very interesting examples of instruction and, in their playground where you can write a very simple prompt like, here is a document that I just downloaded from the web, can you summarize it for my son who's 10 years old? And then with a very small number of examples like this, GPT-3 can actually do a fairly good performance. Now, one thing that I can see is that it works pretty well when the output is something simple, like, for example, classification decision, maybe up to translation, maybe up to summarization. But it doesn't really understand the common sense reasoning part. So we actually are working on a project right now where we have created a data set of what we call logical stories. Those are examples of sentences like Garfield is a cat, and then all cats have whiskers, and then you have questions like, does Garfield have whiskers? So we're currently working on this data set, and we have found out that the performance of models like GPT-3 is actually pretty bad. In some cases, they do surprisingly well, like, for example, if the example is completely self-contained. But once it starts referring to some outside knowledge from like the pre-trained model, then the performance drops to something like 50%, which is very, very, very low. And then the next question was about different languages. Yeah, so that is actually a very good point. I want to mention here briefly a project that is happening right now. I have a small role in it, so I'm not the right person to give you more details about it. It's called Big Science. You may have heard about it. So Big Science was started by people at Hugging Face in New York, and it currently includes 700 participants from, I believe, 50 different countries. And one of the main goals of this project is to train, a really large language model that has two additional properties that some of the other language models don't have. So one is that will be highly multilingual eventually, and it also will be, it is actually being trained on data with clear provenance, like rights, and then there are provisions included in the model for removing, personal identifying information, for retraining, if certain pieces of data are found to be, compromised or tainted in some way. But again, the goal of that project and also many other projects that are happening, in major research labs is to go to a large number of languages, not just English. Now, in terms of minority languages, we're not there yet. I don't think that people are working very actively on this, but there are a lot of examples with few-shot learning for language transfer. And I believe in the future, this is going to become even more prominent.
Thank you. Professor Mukherjee, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, Drago. So I was just wondering, like in the first part of your talk, when you were discussing about extracting SQL queries from natural language text, so if I subset the problem to only scientific documents, so do you think that the problem becomes easier, or are there different challenges that would crop up? So what would be your take? Like, can one take up that as an independent problem and try to solve it? Would there be enough NLP and machine learning challenges out there?
I see. I agree that if you restrict your domain to be something that is a little bit cleaner text, so text that is more grammatical, which typically occurs in news, but also, as you mentioned, in scientific documents, then you should have an easier time, building a better model. But I don't know specifically how much training data you would be able to obtain in a domain like this, and also how well you should be able to transfer from one, let's say, one science to another. So if you have training data, let's say in the life sciences, does that mean that you get good performance in social sciences or in medical papers?
Okay, thank you. So these days, like people typically submit the LaTeX files. Also, they submit the JSON files and things like that along with their main submission. So do you think that could come to some help, like in generating the ground truth or the training data?
I see. Yeah, so I'm not particularly sure about JSON files, but as you probably know, there has been a lot of work, especially in the last year or so, on training pre-trained language models for code generation and for executable code in particular. So you have data sets that include, let's say, descriptions of problems, but also the code to solve them, and also the comments and the specs of the programming. So if you can train on both the code and the input text, so that usually results in some very interesting, systems like the, I forget what it's called. There's the Codex, but there's also this assistant for GitHub. I'm not sure, I forget the name of it, that was released very recently.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. So one last question. Does the proposed techniques also apply to text to SparkQL for graph databases?
Well, yeah, thank you. That's a very good question too. So we have not worked with SPARQL data sets yet, but we have been discussing them, and in particular looking at the graph representations of questions, in the form of those RDF trees. I believe that it should be very feasible to develop text to SPARQL using this kind of intermediate graph representation.
Thank you, Drago. Thank you very much. I would
Thank you, Vidisha.
I would like to thank again all the speakers and all the panelists and attendees. Yeah. So we will close the session now.
Not close.
Yeah.